The movie begins at the airport in Saudi Arabia with two young Indian men named Najib and Hakim. They are standing in front of the passport officer at the airport and they try to talk to the officer, but they don't know how to speak Arabic. The officer stamps their passports and they leave. Then they look for their sponsor in the reception hall, but they don't find him. They stand there, wondering who to ask or what to do, until they find an Indian worker at the airport. He takes their sponsor's number from them and calls them from the phone at the airport, but the worker doesn't answer. The worker tells them that today is Friday, and Friday is a holiday in Saudi Arabia, and this is definitely the company's number, the sponsors and the two locks for the vacation, and reassures them that their sponsor is definitely coming on the way and might be late because of the traffic. So Najib and Hakim go outside the airport and wait for their sponsor, and after a while they find a person looking at them intently and asks Najib if his name is Abdullah and who he is following, but Najib and Hakim do not understand what he is saying, so this person gets angry with them and mocks them and calls them crazy and leaves them and walks away, but he comes back again and takes their passports and then comes back to them again and tells them that they are the two young men who came from India to work for him, and takes them with him to move in his car. And at that moment Hakim and Najib are happy because they finally found their sponsor, and at that moment Najib asks the sponsor to give him some water to drink, so he shouts at him in Arabic because he talks a lot and is angry and asks him and Hakim to get in the car so they can move quickly. And when Najib opens the car door to get in, the sponsor yells at him again in Arabic and gestures for him to sit in the back with Hakim and their bags. Hakim is upset because the car is a semi-truck and small, so they will sit in the exposed part of it. How come the company they are coming in didn't send them a good car, even though he still sees the Sri Lankans who were with them on the plane wanting an air-conditioned car from their company? Najib asks him to be quiet now and get in the car so they can move, and the sponsor stops annoying them. On the way, they think about calling their families to let them know they have arrived. Hakim asks the sponsor to stand somewhere with a telephone so they can reassure their families. The sponsor is upset because the police will stop him for standing instead of sitting. After a long time on the road, Hakim falls asleep from exhaustion, and at that moment, Najib covers up because it's cold and they notice that they've reached the desert, and the sponsor gets out of the car and calls a person named Abu Khalid and asks Hakim to get out of the car, and Najib stays in the car as he is, so Najib gets out after him and they say that he and Hakim are supposed to go back together and that they need a phone to talk to their family, but the sponsor then annoys him in Arabic and asks him to get back in the car and not get out of it until he tells him. But Najib doesn't understand a word, and Hakim tries to talk to the sponsor and Abu Khalid in English, but they don't understand and annoy him, and Abu Khalid takes Hakim with him and closes the door behind them. And at that moment Hakim is shocked and devastated because they took Najib to his place, which is another place, and they beat the sponsor at that moment so that he gets in the car and shuts up, and Hakim keeps crying and cursing Najib so that he doesn't walk and leave him. And after that Najib arrives at another place far away in the desert, and at that moment the sponsor calls on a person named Jasser and asks him to keep Najib with him until morning, and then he leaves. Najib tries to make Jasser understand that he needs a phone, so Jasser answers him in Arabic and tells him tomorrow and that he has to sleep now. Sadly, Najib doesn't understand anything he says. Then he sees an old, tired-looking man with torn, shabby clothes and a body that seems to have gone without water for years. Najib is surprised that Hind is just like him and asks him if there is a phone here and that he is very thirsty and wants to drink. The old man asks him why he is here and points to a water barrel for him to drink from. Najib goes to the barrel and keeps drinking a lot of water, and it becomes clear that he was very thirsty, and suddenly he is frightened by a camel that approaches him, so he moves away from it and keeps looking around. The old man asks where he sleeps, so he tells him to sleep anywhere. And at that moment Najib enters the tent where Jasser is sleeping, spreads a cloth on the ground and sleeps. Naguib worked as a construction worker, extracting sand from under the river water in the tent. His colleague at work offers him an imported cigarette from the Gulf, brought by his sister's husband who works in Saudi Arabia. He offers to let him find him a zero visa, so Naguib asks him about the price of the visa because he doesn't have any money now and will have to sell the house to buy it. His colleague suggests mortgaging the house for 2 months, after which he can use the money and repay the visa cost. After work, Naguib goes with his colleague to his sister's husband, and he learns that his name is Karafuta, and he gives him. At that time, Najib gets the visa money and knows that he sold all his possessions and the gold he had with him, so Karafuta tells him that all expatriates did that in the beginning. And then Najib asks him what would happen if the visa was forged, so Karafuta gets angry with him and tells him that half of the country's people are traveling in the Gulf and the rest are hoping that he will go to the company he is going to and get his money back because he doesn't trust him. So Najib apologizes to him at that moment and knows that he didn't mean to doubt him. And after that we see Sain and Najib's wife sitting with his mother, and they talk together about Najib's travel and that he will eat a lot of meat there because the Arabs love him and eat him all the time. And he was upset once when her brother Nasser came back from his trip because he had eaten a lot of meat, so Najib's mom asks her to give Najib the numbers of her brothers Nasser and Hussein because they are also in Saudi Arabia, and he might need them at some point. But it is clear that Sain is very worried about her brothers because she talked to them a lot about her penalty visa, but they ignored her and did not care about him. Najib returns home and asks his mother to make biryani before he travels, telling her to take care of Sain due to her pregnancy. We go back to the present time, and at that moment Chasser wakes up and sees Najib sleeping next to him. He angrily expels him from the tent and instructs him in Arabic not to re-enter or sleep beside him, as his place is outside in the desert. He describes him as a jungle and insults him and warns him that if he sees him in his tent again, he will break his legs. Najib is shocked and does not understand Jasser's words. He stands in the desert, clueless. The next morning, Najib wakes up to the sound of goats and sees the old woman. He milks the goat and gives him milk to take to the sponsor. And he forgets that Najib doesn't speak Arabic, so he thinks that Najib is drinking the milk because he is thirsty and hungry. But the old woman annoys him and tells him that the milk is for Jasser, so Najib goes to Jasser in the tent, who is sitting there praying to God to protect him from all evil and keep him safe. When he sees Najib standing in front of the tent, he signals for him to come in and takes the milk from him. He drinks it all and tells him in Arabic to go outside so that he can explain his work in India. But Najib remains standing as he is because he doesn't understand anything that was said, and he tells Jasser that he doesn't understand Arabic, so Jasser gets angry with him and tells him angrily that he doesn't want to hear him speak Hindi in front of him because he has a headache and can't stand his chatter in the morning. So Najib gets scared and tries to make him understand that he came here on the basis that he works in the company and returns to help him get back to the airport, but Jasser deals with it with his violence. He throws him out of the tent in the middle of the goats and asks the old man to teach him the job. At the same time, the sponsor comes, so Najib runs to ask him to let him call his family. As soon as the sponsor sees him, he gives him a sack to carry. Najib tells him that he wants to call because he is the one who brought him the visa and told him that he's coming to work as a laborer in a company and that he will have an air-conditioned room for one night. The sponsor ignores him as he doesn't understand and asks him in Arabic to take the sack into the tent. Najib goes to the tent and puts the sack in it and looks at Jasser and the sponsor with new sadness and thinks about how he will make them understand him. Then he finds them giving him a galabia and boots. They look old and worn out. Najib tries to talk to them again and brings a blank passport to show them the visa and the paper of the company he came for, on which the name Karofuta is written, and his number, and at that moment the sponsor tears up the papers and the zero passport, so Najib is shocked and shouts at work and picks up the papers from the ground before he flies and looks at him with anger and sadness, and at that moment we understand that the sponsor and Jasser are hiding something, and after that the sponsor is sitting baking bread with Jasser and calls him to Najib, but he does not respond to them and ignores them, so they spread the bread so that he can come and eat from them, so he is forced to go to them to take the bread from them and eat because he is very hungry, and he grabs the bread and eats it greedily, and at that moment he chokes while he is eating, so Jasser gives him cups of water to drink and teaches him to water the bread in it and eat it to soften it and not choke from it again. Then Najib goes to the old man again and asks him about the way from where and how to get out of the desert. He tells him he's beaten and weak and the road is too far. He leaves and walks off. Then Najib sits alone and remembers his days with his sickness and his joy at her pregnancy and his waiting for his child to come. They decided to name their daughter Safia and their son Nabil. He remembers the day he traveled and his mother and Sina were sad when saying goodbye to him. Mama Hakim recommended him because it was his first time away from her and she would feel reassured while he was with her. When Najib wakes up from his memories, he goes to take a bath among the sheep. When Jasser sees him using the water, he yells at him and fights with him. He knows that he doesn't pay money for the water to use it to clean himself. Najib tells him that he needs water to clean himself after taking a shower. But Jasser ignores him, and then the old man tells Najib that in order to clean himself later, he will have to use sand. An Indian worker arrives and we find out that he is employed by the water company. He refills Jasser's water tank daily. Then Najib asked him to take him with him in the car and take him to the road because he wanted to walk from the desert and he didn't know how. The sponsor arrives and argues with the water company worker for talking to Najib at the same time. And he asks him if he asked him to escape, but the worker denies this. Then the sponsor will train Najib with his wheels. Then Najib grabs his hand and stops him. This drives the sponsor crazy. He asked him if he dared and held his hands to prevent him from hitting him. He goes to get his gun from the tent to threaten and scare Najib, so Najib grabs the gun to protect himself. The sponsor will then train him at gunpoint, threatening, insulting and humiliating him. They know that he will kill him and bury him in the desert. At that time Najib would have fallen to the ground. And he finds what walks on the sand. He remembers the time when he was in India and jumped into the river to swim in it. He and Sayo swam together in the river, feeling happy and content. He believes they will be happy together. They lived a love story together. When Najib wakes up from his memories, he continues to cry with fresh sadness. He loudly shouted at Sino. Belal sees the old man, takes care of the tribes, and eats them. He asks him how many years he has been working here. The old man responds with a song. He looks crazy and not in a stable psychological state. The next morning, Jasser yells at Najib because he is still asleep. So Najib wakes up angry. He's surprised that Jasser wants to milk the goats. He was shocked at that time because he did not know how to milk goats, but he is a liar who repeats what Jasser says. He tries to milk the goat, but at this moment it rejects him. Jasser gets angry and teases him, and he teaches him how to hold the goat to milk it. Najib inquires about the vanished old man, but Jasser ignores and remains unresponsive. He tries to make him understand that he has other work to do. That's why the goats must be milked quickly. And he said it, hitting him and following him, so Najib gets scared and is forced to try milking the goats again. He discovers two sheep butting each other and attempts to intervene to calm them, but they end up butting him. When he covers his head from the pain, Al-Qairov thinks that he is going to butt him. He attacks him and hits him on the head. He falls to the ground and faints. At the same time, the sponsor comes and shoots the victim in the chest with his gun. The sheep and goats scare him, so he goes to Najib, throws water on him and wakes him up. He makes him drink a little water and makes him angry because the sheep and lambs left. And he asks him to gather them again, and say it deprives him of water all day long, so Naguib is unable to move. At that same moment, a goat comes and stands next to Naguib, and he feels as if she senses him and his pain. She gathers all the goats around her without us having to go after them. Al-Najib feels God's mercy and cries with joy. He hugged the goat and it collapsed. Over time, Naguib's appearance changes completely. He is shocked by his scruffy beard when he looks at himself in the car mirror. The sponsor breaks the mirror to prevent Naguib from looking at it again and mocks him, asking if he thinks he is handsome. So Naguib takes a broken glass from the mirror and tries to cut his beard with it, crying and collapsing, but he doesn't know how. At the same time, he feels oppressed and humiliated. He looks at the sky and asks God if what is happening is wrong and feels that the world has wronged him and was unfair to him and decides to commit suicide. But then he sees the hawks eating the flesh of a dead body, and when he gets close to it, he knows that it is the body of an old woman, so he gets even more angry and fights the hawks to keep them away from the body. Then he sits and smells the jar of musk that Mantu gave him and sells it to him and curses her and complains to her that he is suffering and needs her. At that moment, he runs into the desert, and at that same moment the sponsor sees him and runs after him and rides his camel and shoots him in the leg and gets off the camel and keeps hitting him violently and stomping on Naguib's feet with his feet and cursing and insulting him and telling him that he is a dog. At night, we see Naguib tied among the goats and sheep, but he is able to free himself and tries to walk, but he cannot. And he suffers greatly because of the pain he feels, and he is forced to quench his thirst and drink from the water that the sheep drink from. The next morning, Naguib is walking with the sheep like every day, and suddenly it starts to rain, so he and the sheep hide under the rocks until the rain stops. At that moment, he has a small morsel of food, so he eats a piece of it and gives the sheep a piece to eat with him, even though this morsel is very small and his hand is enough, but he does not get up to see the sheep coming. At that moment, he hears the sound of other sheep coming from afar, so he goes to see where this sound is coming from, and is shocked at that moment when he sees Hakim in front of him, and he can recognize him from his voice, because Hakim's appearance has become strange, as well as his hair, and he is also as tall as Naguib. He tells Naguib that they must escape together now, but Naguib is desperate and realizes that he has tried many times to escape and failed. A few days later, he sees Naguib Hakim leaving with a message, but the sponsor arrives, so Naguib stays hidden. He takes the message and waits until he leaves. He goes to take the message after that and reads it. Hakim informs him that his sponsor beat him severely for talking to him about an African man working with Ibrahim who could help them escape. Naguib is happy and hopeful again. Later, he meets Hakim and Ibrahim, who welcomes him and introduces himself. He mentions that their sponsor's daughter will get married in a few days, and this will be a rare opportunity to escape. On the night before the wedding, we see Naguib locked up with the sheep and everyone sitting there eating and singing. He goes to Naguib's sponsor at that time and he gives him a piece of meat to eat. As soon as the day comes, Jasser leaves to go to the wedding, and Naguib advises the sheep because he will not return again until tomorrow morning. And when he leaves, he dares to go, and Naguib turns on the water and drinks and takes a bath and greets him at that time because he forgot the feeling of water while he touches his body, and he frightens the clothes he is wearing to wear the clothes he came in, but he finds them too wide for him, and he tries at that time to find any strings to tie his pants around his waist, and he puts the food for the camels and sheep before he leaves, and he feels sad at that time as he bids them farewell because they were with him and beside him the whole time. And after that, he takes his bag and walks with Hakim Ibrahim, and when the night comes to them, Hakim is very tired and thirsty, so he asks Ibrahim to stay with Naguib, and he will try to act and sneak into any tent to get water from it, but at that time the tent owners see him and think he is a thief and shoot him, so he and Naguib are able to escape from them. In the morning, Hakim and Tanyum see Najib, Hakim and Ibrahim still walking in the desert, and they don't have food or drink with them, and the sun is very scorching and the weather is hot and there is no breeze. At one point, Hakim asks Ibrahim if they are walking in the right direction, so they know that they have to keep walking in the direction of the sun. While walking, they suddenly come across a decomposing dead camel in the desert, which looks terrifying and frightening. At that moment, Hakim gets very scared and feels that their fate will be like the camels because of the heat and thirst. After that, the three of them wash in the sand, stand up to pray together, and suddenly realize they are in a snake den. Ibrahim saves Hakim and asks Najib to stay still to avoid snake bites. Najib becomes very tired and his feet swell due to the intense heat after walking barefoot for an hour, so Ibrahim ties his feet. He wore clothes to shield his feet from the hot sand and walked. As they neared the end of their journey, Hakim collapsed from exhaustion and blamed Ibrahim for their predicament, suggesting that he wanted to escape and discover that living among the sheep was now more merciful. At that time, Ibrahim stands and prays, repeating the tasbih and supplications. Being physically stronger than Hakim and Najib, he can take care of them a little when he returns. And Basant Hakim was walking all the way, and suddenly, while on the way, Hakim had hallucinations and saw the sand as water. He eats it without realizing and will slap anyone who tries to stop him. Then he falls to the ground, bleeding from his mouth, and Najib collapses out of fear for him. And Peter Ibrahim is begging him to help him, but Ibrahim knows that Hakim will die soon, and indeed, Hakim dies at that very moment in the hands of Al-Najib. Suddenly, a sandstorm hits them, and Najib refuses to leave Hakim's body. Ibrahim is forced to carry him to keep them away from the storm. But unfortunately, the storm will reach them. When the storm subsides and ends, Naguib remains devastated because of what happened to Hakim. He is desperate and doesn't want to move from his place. He appears to be severely depressed, but then Ibrahim gets up against his will and they know they have to continue on their way. Ibrahim discovers that his noble legs are terribly twisted and swollen, making it impossible for him to stand. Suddenly, a lizard passes in front of them, so he follows it until it is surrounded by palm trees full of burial mounds. Ibrahim Naguib is forbidden from attacking the water and drinking too much of it at once. They drink it drop by drop until his body is ready to drink normally again. Then, while they were walking, they saw a biscuit on the ground and the calf had become a cart. They were very happy at that moment. This means they are close to the road and walk on the same road, so the calf is moving. They are shocked to discover that the path is gone and they feel hopeless once more. Naguib wakes up to find Ibrahim missing. I left him a bottle of water from the lake. Ibrahim surrendered and chose to end his life. Naguib continues on his way, drinks the last drop of water and eats the food he has. He doesn't know how to continue the rest of the way. Suddenly he finds himself on the road, but no one is willing to stand up and help him, because everyone was afraid of his appearance. He stays like this all night long, and the next morning God will help us bring a good person and tell him. He stops his car as soon as he sees him, and he decides to help him, but Naguib is afraid and wanted at first. This person tries to reassure him and gets him into the car. I give him water to drink and quench his thirst. He looked at him sadly and sympathetically. He asks himself what brought him to this state. Then he takes him to the city and Naguib can't believe that someone helped him. He thanks this kind person and cries. Naguib kept walking in the streets until a group of Indians saw him. The place is occupied by its residents. He assists with showering, haircuts, and shaving. A nurse he knew, an Indian like them, brought him to them to give him vitamins and treat his fever. One of them helps him reach his family and talk to them. As soon as he hears their voices, the sheets fall apart. Especially when he hears his little son's voice. We know from his wife that she named him Nabil as they agreed. Then Naguib goes to the police station so he can get new papers and a new passport. Suddenly, he sees Ibrahim's picture hanging among the missing people. We see Naguib standing with all those arrested on charges of escaping from their sponsors. Suddenly, Naguib gets very scared because he sees a sponsor violently training one of them in front of the police. He is more scared when he sees his sponsor approaching. He told him that if he was his real sponsor, he would have made him suffer long ago because he escaped from it. Naguib realizes that the person he thought was his sponsor had actually stolen the sponsorship from the airport. He took advantage of his lack of understanding of the language. No one will help him because they will not understand him. And then we bring him crying. Then we find out that Naguib spent 3 months in prison until he was granted permission to leave the